So my name is Denise Knights, and I'm the youngest daughter of Marcia and Artur Robert, who were missionaries in Madagascar from 1950 to 1985. And I was adopted at 3 months old and moved to Madagascar with my adopted brother Michael and my parents' biological daughter Claudia. I lived there my whole life until I came to the States, to Minnesota in 1985, actually 86. And my formative years were in Madagascar in the missionary community. And I went to boarding school at age 5.5, 6, like my siblings, and continued in boarding school my whole life. My mother came over to Madagascar as a registered nurse in 1950, and my father came with the French Lutheran Church in 1955. They got married, and my mom started working as a nurse in my dad's schools. And in 1974, the American Lutheran Church employed my dad to be part of their mission field. And from that point until 1985, when he retired, he was employed by the American Lutheran Church. The reason why the ELCA is responsible today is they absorbed the American Lutheran Church, and in doing so, absorbed all of their problems, unfortunately. The American Lutheran Church no longer exists, and it's up to the ELCA now to make reparations. I really don't know when the abuse started, but the first time I was personally aware of it, I was about 9 or 10 years old and on break from school. And my dad was giving French lessons in his office, and I heard some strange noises. So I, being a little kid, went to see what was going on in there, and I peeked through the keyhole and saw a naked girl on my dad's desk, and my dad doing sex acts on her. And I didn't really understand what it was, but I knew it was wrong, and knew that I needed to keep it a secret. As the years went on and I grew older, I did understand what was going on, and I continued to see this for the years all the way up until 1985. And I didn't tell anybody because I was terrified until I was older. And then I did go on and tell my therapists and my family, and even told a few missionaries along the way, and said, my dad abused girls when he was a missionary. So it wasn't until a year ago that I actually learned adults at the time knew and had done nothing about it. In fact, it seems to me today that there was a cover-up. I was at a missionary kids reunion in Anoka County with some kids I grew up with, and at the party with my brother and my husband, one of the guys I went to school with, well, she's like 18 years older than me, but he grabbed my boob full on as I was leaving the party, and I disassociated. So for 13 hours, I couldn't speak of it, didn't even tell my husband or brother or anybody. And then the next day, I started processing what had happened to me, and I posted on Facebook in our missionary group, to the man who grabbed my boob last night, you won't be doing this again, kind of thing. And a few hours later, he replied with a private messenger message to me, telling me the story about how my dad had abused girls in Madagascar, and that he had learned about this from the chair of the mission field, who had apparently learned about this from a synod president in Madagascar in the early 80s. That was the first time, about July of 2021, that I learned adults at the time knew about my dad's abuse and did nothing. Since then, I learned that the missionary chair had taken a message to the mission in the States, asking my dad to be moved because there was a revolt at the school he was at. And their answer was to move him to an all-girls school. And that's where he spent the last 3 years of his service, abusing girls at an all-girls school until his retirement. So we know my dad was an abuser, and we know the guy who grabbed my boob was an abuser. And we also know that the missionary chair, Irv Toso, was made aware of this, and the Southeast Synod president had asked him to do something about it. So those are the facts that we do know about today. How do we know there's a cover-up? Well, we do know it was never reported to the States, and we know Irv Toso carried a letter from my father to the States the year it was reported, and asked that he be moved to a different school because the students had revolted in Manantanteli, and the mission moved him to another girls' school. So my next step was to try to find the victims that my dad had abandoned in 1985 when he came home to retire. It was the middle of COVID, and I hadn't spoken or seen these women in 40 years, but I sat down with my brother and learned that he had also seen my dad abusing girls in his office, in our bathroom, at the dorm movies. And so we sat down and made a list of names of girls and tried to figure out how old they might be and where they might be living. And with my contacts in Madagascar, I was able to locate a few of them initially. And their first reaction was, oh, I don't know anything about that, but you should talk to so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. And then after telling them, I saw my dad do this to girls and it wasn't their fault, and my dad was in a position of power, and I explained to them that I was really reaching out to try to help them. And only then did they start telling my story, or telling me their stories, and sharing the fact that this abuse started around 5 when they were 11 or 12 years old, and lasted until my dad retired or until they were able to get away. So these victims are not anonymous victims to me. These were girls that were in my house, that played piano with me, that I actually would wrestle with and play with in our front yard. They are girls I remember. And it's hard, it's personal. Some of them today are living in the poorest part of Madagascar, and there's been a famine going on there for several years. They send me pictures of them in their, small huts, sleeping on straw mats, and many of them have food aid in the background because there's a famine going on. I have so much privilege here with a family that understands these things, with therapists, with a community that supports me, and these women have none of that. And that's why it's so important for me to stand up and use my privilege and my voice to make the world a better place for the people who have suffered so much under my dad's abuse. So many people ask me, if your mother was in the house and you saw this happening when you were home, why didn't the girls scream? Why didn't they tell somebody? You have to understand the culture there. They were not in any position of power. Many of them, this started when they were 11, 12, one as young as 9. And you have to understand the relationship my parents had with the church. My father was somebody you would call a Rai Mandrani, an elder, a respected man, and you didn't go against him. I mean, I knew that in my own house. I wasn't going to go up against him until I found my voice much later on. But my dad was the director of the school, and he would send them a note saying, you must come for French lessons in my office. My dad was a white man, a guest in their country, and yet held a position of power. He was a 50-year-old man. They were 11, 12 years old when this started. And just so many positions of power and control. And I don't really know why my mother was complicit in this. I can't speak to that, but I do feel it's my responsibility, now that I've found my voice and I knew other adults knew about it, to make something happen for these women who suffered all these years with this awful secret. So my journey into helping the victims started by trying to contact the ELCA representative who would make the decision about whether reparations would be paid. That's Rafael Malpica. And about a year ago, August or September of 2021, I was on a Zoom call with him and told him my story. And shortly after that, I had another meeting with him, and my brother was asked to join. And at that time, my brother shared his story. And he arranged for a meeting with the Bishop of Oregon, under whom my father had been rostered. And we shared our story again with her, and then again with the Bishop of Mark Walters's church in Duluth, the man who grabbed my boob. And throughout this process, I came back over and over and over again to my one ask, which is, I'm doing good. I have a husband that supports me, my family, and a great support network. I'm here as a voice for the victims who didn't have a voice when they were children, that didn't have a voice of the last 40 years, and still are afraid to speak up because of the ramifications in Madagascar for women of sexual abuse. So my ask again to the ELCA is, help these women out. I keep asking, and the process has been long and hard, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in another video. So the women, as difficult as it is for them to talk about this early childhood sexual abuse by a pastor and missionary, the church really insisted, the ELCA church insisted they needed to speak with these women personally, look at their body language, that the fact that there were two living witnesses, my brother and myself, willing to testify that we had seen this with our own eyes, that wasn't enough. They wanted to hear from the victims themselves. So it took a lot of time through an interpreter to explain to the women that we needed to have a victim advocate meet with them. On July 2nd, this victim advocate was supposed to go to Madagascar and meet with the women and hear their stories. And July 5th was the day that they were supposed to arrive in a specific town and meet with this victim advocate. And they were promised transportation costs and a hotel and food, and if they would just show up. Well, the victims did travel and showed up. And unbeknownst to me or the victims, that process was at the last minute canceled or postponed, as they said. And so one of the victims showed up, and after a long taxi bus ride, and there was no hotel, there was no transportation costs, and one of the other victims ended up taking her in, and they were calling me as I was on vacation with my husband, and were just baffled, and the church would not reply to me or the victims as to what had happened. So that is one example of the distressing situation based on trying to communicate with the church. Another situation was I won't go into that. I'm not going to go into that. I'll cut that off. So a lot of people are asking, well, why money? Why not just an apology? Well, I grew up in the church, and on Sunday mornings, they don't pass around the offering plate asking for thoughts and prayers. They ask for dollars. And if dollars are good enough for the church, I say it helps and solves a lot of problems, especially in one of the poorest countries in the world where they're going through a famine. These women, money would change their life. They would be able to have a house that's secure. They would be able to access food and be able to send their grandkids to school. This would be life-changing if they could have some financial security, and that's what I'm asking for. So another thing I've been asked is, what are the legal ramifications? And unfortunately, there are none. We all agree the statute of limitations is long past. We all agree the abuser is dead. And jurisdiction is in Madagascar. So there's no legal requirement, but speaking with Raphael and the bishops, they assured me there's a moral obligation. So we agree there's a moral obligation to do something to make this terrible wrong at no fault of these victims. And that's what I'm asking for. Right this wrong. We have the power, and if we as a community, as a society, come together and we say, we're not going to just pass on this. We're going to stand up and we're going to fight for these women who don't have a voice. So what can people do to help? I'm right now asking people to sign this petition because I'm flying to Chicago on Tuesday, and I plan to deliver a printed out petition and deliver it to the ELCA church in Chicago on Tuesday. But there's more we can do, and I think I'm going to try to set up a GoFundMe page, which I haven't done yet, so okay, stay posted for that. People said, well, how does this pertain to me? And I think that if we don't stand together for something as egregious as early childhood sexual abuse by clergy, I don't know what else we can stand for. So I'm asking for you to come stand with me and demand justice for these victims that didn't have a voice then and barely have a voice today. Thank you.